We're going to look at an inventory system as part of this Unit 5 that's developed by InScopeStudios, and there's a long tutorial on it. There's actually quite a few. The first one develops the basic system, and the video is almost I think 2 hours long. So I'm going to give you an introduction, so if you want you can just go through the code and look for it directly, and if you want more details you can go through the videos and watch them, but I'll give you a quick introduction to this. So we're going to look at an inventory system that has these classes in it. Let's run the videos, let's just run it real quick to see what it looks like. So we are this simple player here. I didn't put in a fancy model for the player. And if we hit B or I, an inventory uh, pops up here, and then when we pick up items, they show up in the inventory here. And later on, we can select the different items, and if we right click, it'll use these items. So if we right click here, it should say I used a mana potion or the sword. As we pick things up, later on we can move things around, stack things around, and stuff like that. But for this is just a basic inventory system. We're going to call these slots and items in the slots that we're going to pick up. So let's look at the code again for that. So we are going to have our player, and attached to the player is going to be an inventory system, and this is going to keep track of the size of the inventory, rows and slots of the inventory system. It's going to also have an array list, or a list of game objects for what's stored in each slot. We're going to have the slots themselves out there, and each slot can hold an item. We're actually going to, in this version, we have a stack of items for each one, but the initial code just has a single item in here. So it depends on how many items, if we're going to actually have multiple items in each slot. It's common, like as you pick up 3 health potions, to stack them together and just have a little 3 there. And we're also going to, again, keep track of items and how items work here. Now let's look at the code a little bit. I guess the last thing I'll mention is the inventory manager. This is going to handle some of the interfaces and the graphical display for this code. So let's look at how the scripts are set up inside Unity. Again, we generally assign scripts as components to objects. So we have our player object here, and it has the player script attached to it. And it has some information about how fast we can run. It also will have a link to an inventory object here. So it'll have a public variable that we can tie into our inventory. So that's what's helping it there. We'll also have a set of items out here that we can collect. Each one of these will have the item script attached to it. And we can have some information about each item script. Let's see if, like, we could have some characteristics about each item filled in here. And they can be different for each item on the screen. We can fill these in. And so when we collect an item, we're going to be grabbing this item script, or this item part, and make sure we have that information around for each item that we have. There's also an inventory manager object with the inventory manager script on it. So this is basically an invisible object that just has items on it, and it has links to some of the prefabs for some of the objects out there and some of the text display things, so it knows where to draw things on the user interface. We've got an event system. This is used and a canvas for drawing things. So the inventory is available here, and the tooltips and stuff like that are all in this canvas. And this is all part of the GUI system, the UI system that's created whenever you add UI components to an object. So we have prefabs for things like the health potion or the mana potion or the sword that we can collect, and we can drag those onto the screen. We also have a prefab for a slot and what that looks like, and the display of a slot here. And then we have our inventory item or control or object here also. So let's look at some code. Let's open this up in Visual Studio. So the player script um, inherits some model behavior. It's pretty straightforward. As far as motion, doesn't do anything. But let's look. It has an inventory object that's public, so we can link to it here. We don't have to handle this because, or initialize this because it is set, the link to it is set uh, in this interface. So we have the player here, and we drag in an inventory object here. So that's what initializes the inventory object. And then we just use that object. So when we hit like the B or the I key, we open we call the open method in the inventory. When we bump into something, we call the add item for the inventory and pass whatever we bumped into. At least we pass the item component, the item part of that. So if we bump into an object, we pass basically the item script to this add inventory items. Here. Now, one thing to note is we have an on trigger enter and an on collision enter, and only one of these is generally used. One thing to note is that in one, with on trigger, we set the game object to active or false, make it inactive. And the other one, we destroy the game object, and we'll see what that does in just a sec. We have our inventory objects, our thing here. We have some variables here for setting the size and stuff of the inventory, but the main thing is this kind of array list, or just a list of game objects for the slots, and this is where we store things. We have some things for checking if the inventory is open and displayed on the screen, if there's empty slots, so we can add things here. And then we also find a link. This is somewhat common sometimes. We want a link to the player. So the player already links to the inventory, but the inventory wants to link back to the player. Since we don't have a call that we can pass an object back and forth, when the inventory starts up, it locates the player object and keeps the player reference here for that. It also does sets up some things with the GUI interface. One problem with this inventory management system is it doesn't do great separation between the GUI interface and the actual data. The inventory manager is supposed to be there, and I would have liked to have seen one that did a little better kind of model view controller kind of stuff, where the data model, the inventory system is just the data model, and then like the inventory manager just manage the GUI part of it, and then the data model, the event system, and the canvas is where we're pushing it, and it tries to do that somewhat, but again, we still see some things with the canvas and stuff in the inventory system here. So there's some stuff here about when you click a mouse down or on an item, or you hover over an item, it'll display information. So when you run the inventory system, hover over it, it'll display some information. If you right click on it, it will try to use that system here. So it tries to remove the item from the slot and use it in some way. So there's also code in here for dropping an object. If we drop an object from inventory, it will try to instantiate it back near where we are at here. I'm going to skip over some of the stuff where we're showing the tooltips and formatting this or creating the layout. I'm not too interested in that here. Add item is what we call from player. We add this item in here, and then we try to find an empty slot to place it in. So we check, make sure we have an empty slot, and we look through the slots, try to find an empty one and add it in here. So this is a basic routine for just adding an object. Now, one thing that we will, when we find an empty slot, it should have some slot code or a link to the actual slot resource in that object. So with all these things, we have the player object, and then we have the player.cs script that runs in it, and usually when you're going from one script to the other, you want to get access to the actual script at the other end so you can work with that and call items. So like here, we're going to find the a variable that will link us to the not just the slot object, but the slot code in the object. So if we look at a slot, inside that is the slot script, and that is this script here, and it has properties like add item or things like that. Add item here. So from inventory, we don't just need the slot, which is the game object. We need to get the code, the script part of it. So we're going to get a link to that with this get component call. Check that we found it, and then call add item, call the method. So this add item is this add item in the slot script that's attached to the slot game object for that. Most of these things will be inheriting from like player mono behavior, which is the default for game objects here. Slot also is a game object and linked here. And inventory is also a game object here. Now slot, you can also click on it, and so it will handle a certain right-click component here. So let's look at slots. So we can add items to slot. There's these little checks again if they're emptying that, and adding items to this. We're going to change the sprite, and then we have some set sprites that are out there tied to this item. So for every item that's out there, so any item that can be collected has the item script on it, and it has a neutral and a highlighted sprite. So we drag in two sprites to show what it should display here. So that's what, when we add an item, we change the sprite and set this neutral and highlighted sprite for that item. When we use an item, we're going to call use for that item that's in that slot, and then we're going to change the sprite and empty the slot up here. So every item will have to have a use thing. So if we look back at items, then they will have a use method here. And we, again, depending on what type, because again, this same item thing could be attached to multiple different items, will link in things. Now, one thing's interesting here is that item here is just a script, a component can be added to any items. A lot of times in code, we'll use interfaces and we'll drop it in. Unity has these is more component based for its code. So like here, if we have different things, we can drag in different component scripts in it, and we can add different component scripts. So we can grab the item script and add it to each one. So that kind of serves similar purposes to interfaces. So we don't see interfaces as much in Unity as we would in other areas. But the problem is that then the same item script is used in all the items, and so then we sometimes see these checks for the type of item and doing things differently, where if we have in other places we might have different code implementing different interfaces, and then each of those codes would just be attached to those objects. So this is our item, and then again we just have some information for displaying information about an item and working with an item. And finally, the inventory manager just keeps track of our different types of items that we can display and how we kind of display them on the screen and collect them for this. Now, we want to make sure we only have one inventory manager on the screen, so we use what's often called the Singleton pattern here. So in the constructor, and again, we really don't have a constructor. Well, here we do kind of have a constructor, but often we don't have a constructor. Sometimes it's in the start method, but here we have a constructor here of this instance, and we're going to check if we're going to keep track of an instance here. Up at the top of the screen, an inventory manager will keep a track of the inventory manager object here as an instance, and it's static. So static means it's shared in memory between all the objects. So there's only one version of it across all the objects if there's more than one inventory manager. And then we check if that instance is null, and that means we don't have an inventory manager there. And then we'll find the inventory manager, an inventory manager on the screen, and put that and use that as our instance. If we've already set the instance somewhere, then we just return this. So what this tries to do is just only instantiate one inventory manager. What it really does is it doesn't instantiate more than one, but it always uses one. It'll always find one and return the first one. That find object by type will return. So this tries to limit and only use one inventory manager in case someone's developing this and drags in another inventory manager onto our screen. So And some of this code here is used for stacking and stuff like that, which may not be implemented in all of these areas. One thing I wanted to mention, I don't think I did, is with slots. We right here we just have a single item that's in our slot, but again, it is later on in the scripts they switch this to a stack of items, and then they'd use a collection of items that in each slot. So. Okay, that introduces you to the basic inventory object. You can watch the video from InScopeStudio for a lot more detail on how they worked through this. But you should be able now look at the code and answer the basic questions that are posted in this assignment.